In its program's history, TCU has had a lot of good quarterbacks with guys like Andy Dalton, Kenny Hill, Trevon Boykin, and most recently Max Duggan, but nobody really knows about their quarterback now. When you take a look at the guys who are leading college football statistically, nobody really knows anything about Josh Hoover. Currently, Hoover is number 3 in the country in terms of total passing yards, and is also tied for 6th in terms of passing touchdowns. Josh Hoover is definitely a college football superstar this year, but again, he's the best kept quarterback secret that nobody knows about. And going back in time, Hoover was never really supposed to be here, as he was always underranked as a quarterback recruit, was originally going to go to Indiana, and now all of a sudden has become the face of TCU, and still no one really even sees him. But today we're going to talk about him. We're going to go through Josh Hoover's story, and how he became one of the better quarterbacks in college football when he seemingly had no chance of that ever happening. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about Josh Hoover. So Hoover comes from a football family, as his dad Alex was a linebacker at Colorado State and also spent some time in the NFL. Rockwall Heath High School first opened up in 2005 in Texas, and since then they've been to the playoffs nearly 10 times. In 2008, Rockwall Heath even defeated Highland Park to finish 10-0 in the regular season, and that was their best year. Flash forward about a decade, and their future was just as bright, as they had a quarterback who could lead them to a better season than 2008. Many believed that Josh Hoover was the next big thing at Rockwall, as he followed in the footsteps of former blue-chip quarterback Braden Locke, who put up insane numbers and spent time at both Mississippi State and now Wisconsin. Hoover started all 10 games as a sophomore that year, and despite a .500 record, he had a crazy year. He ended up throwing for 2,926 yards with 32 touchdowns and just 7 picks, and also completed 61% of his passes. He said, quote, "I think just practice and repetition and the ability that God has blessed me with has led me to this success." Since Hoover had a breakout sophomore season, he became a bigger name on the recruiting trail. Schools like Arkansas, Illinois State, Incarnate Word in North Texas all reached out and gave the Dallas guy an offer, and he said, quote, "It's definitely been different and something that you never really expect to happen, but it's been cool to see the way the coaches are still trying to reach me and recruit me in such a difficult time." This was going on during 2020 and 2021 when the world was in a crazy spot. He followed that up his junior season, throwing for 3,556 yards and 36 touchdowns, and Hoover was now one of the better quarterbacks in the state of Texas, but still nobody was really talking about him. Before his senior season though, he ended up making his college decision, choosing the Indiana Hoosiers over in the Big Ten. He said, quote, "After talking to Coach Nick Sheridan and head coach Tom Allen, I really started to think about it, and this past weekend really summed it up. The offense is a great fit, and Coach Sheridan is one of the top young play callers, and I look forward to learning from him." At the time, he also said that he loved Indiana's passion for basketball, as he would compare that to Texas's love for high school football. Hoover ended up having a crazy senior season, as he threw for over 3,200 yards with 40 touchdowns and only 10 interceptions. He also won the District 6A MVP in Texas, beating out a ton of high-caliber quarterback prospects. He's also given the Landry Award for the best high school player in North Texas, and previous winners of that included Myles Garrett and Kyler Murray, so Hoover was in elite territory. Then he changed things up. He said, quote, "I just want to thank the entire Indiana program for the opportunity to be a Hoosier, and after praying and talking with family, I've decided to go a different direction. Special thank you to Coach Allen and the entire coaching staff, and wish nothing but the best." So once TCU came in with a new staff and hired Sonny Dykes away from SMU, all of a sudden, Hoover wanted to go there. The new staff reached out to him and gave him an offer, and Hoover essentially accepted it on the spot. He was now going to be going down the street to TCU, and this was a huge deal for him. He said, quote, "I shouldn't be here. I mean, I was committed to Indiana, and I didn't have offers like this. And so Coach Dykes took a chance on me, and I just can't express how grateful I am." Hoover was an accurate passer with a decent arm, as he threw for over 9,000 yards and 108 touchdowns in his high school career, which included that 40-touchdown senior season. Hoover said, quote, "I was never a high recruit. I was never someone who people really wanted. I always, for some reason, felt in my own heart, though, I was going to be the guy somewhere else someday." According to 24/7 Sports, Hoover was a 3-star recruit, the number 41 quarterback, and the 709th best player in the class of 2022. So how would he end up doing at TCU, as he went under the radar? When Hoover arrived at TCU, he would join a quarterback room that included Max Duggan, Chandler Morris, and Sam Jackson, all of which were high-profile recruits. Sonny Dykes had a reputation at developing quarterbacks, including former number 1 overall pick Jared Goff while he was at Cal. Goff was a perfect example of a talented quarterback who knew how to manage the game and take chances, and they saw a lot of Hoover in him. Eventually, he would end up sitting on the bench as a backup for the 2022 season, and that's when TCU went off and ended up making the playoff. Max Duggan would end up having a historic season for the Horned Frogs, and Hoover got to watch and wait during that time. Going into 2023, Chandler Morris would retake that starting quarterback job, so it looked like Josh Hoover was going to be on the bench and would just have to learn. Except, then Chandler Morris ended up getting hurt. Now midway through the season, Hoover was supposed to be the guy, and in his first career start against BYU, we would welcome Josh Hoover to college football, but nobody really talked about it. He ended up going 37 of 58 for 439 yards and 4 touchdowns, all to different receivers. The Frogs won 44-11 over BYU, and after the game was over, his receiver said, quote, "Even when he was a backup, he prepared like he was the starter. I'm not sure you come around kids of his character and ability too often. He showed a lot of people what he's capable of today, and I think he might have even showed himself a little bit of what he can do." Sonny Dykes said he was really proud of the poise that he showed and that he never got rattled and the game was never too big for him. During that game, he became the first TCU quarterback since Casey Pascal to throw for 4 touchdowns in his first career start. Sadly though, Hoover and the Frogs would end up stalling out in 2023, as in his 6-game stretch, the Frogs only managed to win 2 of those games. They beat BYU and then beat Baylor. He still had a couple of good games though, as he had 3 touchdowns in that win over the Bears, and then he had 344 yards and 5 touchdowns in a loss to Oklahoma in the final game of the season. In total, Hoover threw for 2,206 yards with 15 touchdowns and 9 picks, and 2 more scores on the ground. The Frogs were just 1 season removed from their remarkable 2022 playoff run, but sadly TCU went 5-7, missed out on a bowl, and just really weren't all that good. During his final 6 starts, this was good enough to make him an honorable mention Big 12 Offensive Freshman of the Year, and now he was going to be the guy going into 2024. He said that this year he was the centerpiece and that this year's roster was unselfish and littered with players who didn't want to be stars, but instead wanted to win a championship. The Horned Frogs still had an interesting quarterback room, as Ken Seals came in from Vanderbilt, and they also landed another 4-star blue-chip recruit, Haas Heine. In 2024 so far, Josh Hoover has gone crazy. In his first game against Stanford, he led them on the road with 3 touchdowns and 353 yards, and they would beat the Cardinal 34-27. In week 2, they'd come home and he'd put 2 touchdowns up against Long Island University, and TCU was 2-0. Sadly, in week 3 though, they'd end up losing a shootout, as against UCF, despite taking a late lead, UCF would end up winning by 1 point, but Hoover went for over 400 yards and 4 touchdowns in that one, and that's when we knew this guy was going to be special this year. Sadly, the next week in their big rivalry game against SMU, he would once again put up 4 touchdowns and nearly 400 yards, but they would get blown out 66-42, as the defense just didn't show up in that one. Hoover would then get his first Big 12 win of the season against Kansas, as he would go into Arrowhead Stadium and throw for 356 yards and 3 scores in that one. We are now about midway through the season, and TCU is in a fragile spot. They ended up blowing a home game to Houston 30-19, and this was really bad. I guess the Cougars are looking a little bit better right now, but if TCU wanted to make a bowl or make a Big 12 run, they needed to have that one. Luckily, they would bounce back the following week, as Hoover would throw for 263 yards and ran for a touchdown in a road victory over Utah, and then in late October against Texas Tech, Hoover once again put up big numbers, throwing for 344 yards and 3 touchdowns against Texas Tech. Luckily, his 2 interceptions didn't cost them the game, as they still ultimately won by 1 point. As we entered the month of November, they had a road contest against Baylor, and those games are typically thrilling, and despite Hoover throwing for 333 yards and having 3 total touchdowns, they would lose that game by 3. This past weekend, Hoover would lead them to a win over Oklahoma State 38-13, and in that game he'd throw for 286 yards and a touchdown. Currently on the year, Hoover has 3,233 yards with 22 touchdowns and 8 picks, and 4 more scores on the ground. As I said, he is currently one of the best quarterbacks in the country, as he's currently tied with 6 other players for touchdowns, as he is tied with John Mateer, Jackson Dart, Malik Murphy, Will Howard, and Dylan Gabriel with 22 scores. And in terms of yards, he's ranked number 3 in the country with 3,233, only behind Jackson Dart and Cam Ward. Honestly, if you put his resume against most of the other quarterbacks, you could make an argument that he is the best quarterback in the Big 12 this year. But I still think that title belongs to Shedeur Sanders right now. I don't know necessarily if Josh Hoover has NFL hype, but he definitely is making himself a more intriguing prospect by the day. I would have never expected this guy to be all that good, as I'm an Indiana football fan, and I remember when Hoover committed to IU, and then I remember when he flipped to TCU, and I thought to myself, he was never going to play there. But he's not only managed to take over the starting job, but become one of the best quarterbacks in the country right now, and his future looks extremely bright. Luckily, because TCU is currently 6-4, he'll at least have 3 more opportunities to put up stats, as they'll play Arizona, Cincinnati, and then some sort of team in a bowl game. Unless Josh has a miraculous end of the season, there's no reason why he would opt out of that bowl game, and we should get a couple more good matchups from him. But to me, this guy is still going under the radar, as nobody talks about Josh Hoover nationally, and what he's done is quite remarkable. But what do you guys think? If you're a TCU fan, what do you think of Josh Hoover? And who's another player who, in your opinion, is going under the radar that I could cover next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.